Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I don't know about you guys, but hasn't the morning already been amazing? Let's give it a. All righty. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Robin Watson-Ellerby. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at IWPR, and it is my special honor to introduce our next speaker. Now, I'm sure you know the name Preston Mitchum. He's well known to many in this room. He's an extraordinary entertainer, an advocate, an activist, and a champion for the rights of historically marginalized communities. And he is one of the nation's strongest and most effective voices on Black people, the LGBTQ community, and young people, like me. Uh, Thank you. Thank you, 29, still claiming it. He is also a very busy man. We were just talking about how busy he is in the hallway. He is a CEO, nonprofit leader, award-winning attorney, media spokesperson, and entertainer as seen on Bravo TV. Now, I gotta say, I was fangirling about that. I've been watching Bravo since the first show. We talking about 2006, Orange County, Real Housewives. That was me. Seems like Preston does it all, but today we get to hear him do what he does best, tell it like it is. Our movement is strong, one for sure, but it is made even stronger by the allies and partnerships we form. Today, Preston will share his thoughts on the intersection between gender, race, LGBTQ movements, and why showing up with our full, complex identities strengthens our collective efforts and leads to stronger policy outcomes. Everyone, please welcome to the power stage, very nicely dressed, Preston Mitchum.
All right, I am Preston Mitchum. I use he, him pronouns, and I am truly honored to be here today. Thank you so much for the Institute for welcoming me to speak to you all today. It's one of the things that I love to do the most is, I'm going to use some language, which is talk shit. Like, it is my favorite thing to do, and it's about being real with all of the things that we're doing and how we're actually connecting the pieces of movement building together. Now, that's really important to me, just given my background as a Black and queer person, but as someone who deeply cares about a lot of issues. And I remember when I used to clerk for a judge, and she would say to me, Preston, you can't care about everything. And I said, I bet you I can. And so maybe it's the double Pisces in my chart. Maybe it's just something that's really important for me to speak up, to make sure we're centering the voices of the most marginalized communities. But it is important for us to do that in our policy, in our research, and especially our lived experiences. So that's why I'm really excited to speak to you all about building movements together. What does interconnectedness mean? What does the framing of intersectionality mean as we're having these conversations about power, about oppression of many communities that are represented here in this room and those who are online. And really, I do it from the framing of not only myself as a policy professional, but also someone who has had the great privilege of being on reality TV. Because it matters a lot, and a lot of people don't believe you can truly show up as your authentic self on TV. And based on my experience, I'm here to tell them that they're incorrect. And even though they're incorrect, there are definitely pressure points and feelings of why people feel that way. And I hope to provide that arc today in this conversation. So, for some, this is a very baseline statement, but I think framing matters, which is why I'm always going to start with, what do we even mean as we're discussing intersectionality? As we know in this room, intersectionality is a term that was coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, and it describes how overlapping identities lead to compounded experiences based on who we are. It can be based on racial identity, gender-based oppression, disability, poverty, or socioeconomic status, among other things. Over the years, I've heard it be used in incorrect ways. Most of those ways have been co-opted by many spaces. But a lot of times when people have discussed it, they discuss it in a way that sounds like adding up. So like, I am Black and queer. Oh, okay, and? What does that mean, right? What does that mean? How does policies impact your Blackness and your queerness? How do policies impact your womanhood? How do policies and research impact X here. And those compounded identities are not just things that exist in research, they do and they should, but they also exist in how we navigate spaces, how we walk down the street, how we enter and exit rooms like even this one here. And despite this term being developed as Professor Crenshaw was evaluating the case to Grafton Reed v. General Motors, I should say the very incorrectly decided, misapplied, misframed case of the Grafton Reed v. General Motors, I would also argue that a lot of the framing is really about things related to the civil rights movement where many black women were excluded from mainstream civil rights movements, and the mainstream white feminist movement where many black women, again, were excluded from those spaces. And a lot of times the conversation that we've seen around that were historically the issues of race in the feminism movement, as many know here, and as many know online, race were things that were too much to discuss, right? It was very gender-centered, right? And for a lot of the people who were leading those movements, gender and race could not coexist. Similarly, the brethren of the civil rights movement made very similar accusations to those black women, but that time it was flipped. Race had to be the center because bringing in gender and sexuality was too much. Right? So I'm always going to honor things like the Combahee River Collective and black women and trans and non-binary folks who oftentimes get forgotten out of movement spaces. Even people like Byron Rustin, who very recently are just now re-entered into the conversation, but was absolutely pushed out of movement spaces and the historical framework that we know of the civil rights movement. So for me, you can never discuss intersectionality and intersectional representation without discussing power, oppression, and privilege. And so these things reveal how systems of privilege and subordination are deeply embedded in society. We know how power operates, its complex ways, its shaping attitudes, its behaviors, traditions, and all of it is around social structures and how they often uphold inequities that exist. And intersectionality as that framework helps us better understand why they exist in the first place and what all of these systems of oppression mean even in the first place. At its core, oppression is the process by which certain groups are systemically marginalized, dehumanized, and disadvantaged. And I think that's important to note. The system is what we're discussing, right? What is systemic harm? I'm always going to keep it real, right? Right? All right. So let's keep it clear in this space that we are not discussing individual harm that happens. Oftentimes, I discuss this, especially black folks. I'm going to talk to us for a second. Oftentimes, I discuss this, especially around colorism and around when I often hear lighter skinned black folks specifically say things I was teased in my childhood for being too light. And I'm like, you were. That hurt. And guess what it didn't do? Create systemic harm. And it hurts, and that's important to note that it hurt. It's a pain, it's an individual pain. And unfortunately, if you look at the black magazines, you're still gonna see yourself, right? Because that is the system that we're discussing. Individual harm hurts. Systemic harm leads to oppression and leads to systemic based oppression, and that is the thing that's important to mention. So we all know all of this is about power of overlapping movements, overlapping systems, racial, reproductive justice, queer liberation, and gender justice. These issues are deeply connected, with each having distinct but overlapping issues. A lot of those movements are linked in things that we all know: bodily autonomy, bodily integrity. So when people say to me, X has no movement here, or Y has no space here, I'm always pushing people to think about the importance of bodily integrity and bodily autonomy and why those issues will always matter, and those connectedness of those movements have to preeminate. An example of this is the struggles that are oftentimes faced by black trans women. Black trans women exist at the unique and often dangerous intersections of race, of gender, and maybe of sexuality. They face extreme rates of violence and discrimination, not only from broader society, but even within Black and LGBTQ plus communities. In the context of racial justice, it is vital to understand that the liberation of Black trans women cannot be separated from the larger fight for Black liberation. To truly fight for things like racial justice, the lives and safety of Black trans women must be visible. Similarly, in my experience, there has been common misconceptions such as feminism is only for women or LGBTQ issues don't affect racial justice. Those things hinder progress by failing to recognize how interconnected these movements are. Feminism, especially in its most interconnected or intersectional form, is about dismantling all forms of gender based oppression. And that affects everyone, including the people who know they benefit from it, right? It impacts every single person. The standards by men and the standards that we believe we have to uphold is a gender based oppression that harms other people. And that is something that's important for us to always recognize because that is within the full scope of patriarchy and of gender based violence. When these movements work in unison, they become stronger together. And I really want to talk a little bit about my work within BYP 100. So, BYP 100, a Black queer feminist organization, and we always approached activism from an intersectional perspective. It was the first organization that I was involved in that specifically identified with a Black queer feminist lens. And I had never seen something like that within an organization. And it was important for me to figure out how this looked, right? Because we can say all the things online, right? We can say all the things within our funder and grant reports, but what are we actually doing to honor that and to practice that? And do other Black queer feminists believe that we have a Black queer feminist lens? And we recognize and we struggled through this. We were not perfect when we were organizing in DC and other places across the United States, but it was one of the ones where we struggled together. It was a principled struggle. It didn't feel just like we were arguing for argument's sake. It was because we deeply believed in the intersection of all these identities, especially about the people who were identified as the most marginalized within our local communities. Working in unison across these systems allowed us to challenge the norms, challenge traditions, and really subvert power that we saw existed. And we recognized then that we cannot achieve true liberation without all of us, without all of these movements being seen together. And that leads me to this. All right. So, if you were just here to hear me talk about Summer House Martha's Vineyard, congratulations. Because I deeply enjoyed my experience, and so Bravo, don't be mad. NBC, don't be mad. I truly enjoyed my experience. It is definitely something for coffee, tea, and cocktails for another day. But I will say, a lot of reality TV, based on my experience, really did center, even unintentionally at times, on tokenism within media and mainstream representation. And I think, or I hope many of us know that around tokenism, it does create this illusion of diversity, but ultimately reinforces isolation. It occurs when individuals from marginalized communities are included in spaces not to amplify their voices or to create change, but to present a facade of diversity. The experience is all too familiar for many people of color, many Black folks, many queer folks, many trans and gender expansive folks, especially when we're the only in any given space, whether it's a workplace, a social setting, an activist movement, or on reality TV. During my time on Summer House Martha's Vineyard, I was the only openly Black queer cast member. And while I continue to always honor and appreciate the opportunity to represent my community on such a visible platform, there were moments, and I discussed this even on the show, where the weight of tokenism became palpable. Being the only person carrying the representation of multiple marginalized communities came with an immense burden. I was often expected to speak on behalf of the Black queer experience, which is an impossible task, as no person can encapsulate the diversity of any community. And these perspectives were oftentimes shared by many viewers, like, oh, I wish Preston had another gay in there. I wish there was another queer for him to talk to about what he's dealing with in here. And I said, yeah, me too. Because the truth is, there's reality in reality TV. And for me, that reality involved not only living in my truth, but also dealing with the pressures and feelings of isolation and tokenism. But the sad reality is, when I say there's reality in reality TV, I can't blame this because that's the reality of reality. And so, in activist spaces, tokenism can be equally detrimental. And it's the thing that I also experience. Black queer people and individuals are included sometimes as a check the box as opposed to a full integral part of the community and movement. And research even supports the harmful effects that people of color and LGBTQ plus individuals who are the only in their workplace or in their world or activist spaces experience. In my activism, I've often found myself in rooms where I was the only black person or queer person, and there are some people who are happy about that. I wasn't one of them. But there is a strength through unity. We know about the power of solidarity and how transformative that is. When movements come together, they don't just share resources, they amplify each other's impact. We amplify the building of each other. We amplify what it means to build inclusive policy outcomes that reach beyond the surface of any one issue. As Audre Lorde once said, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. So when we collaborate across movements, whether racial justice, LGBTQ justice, or repro justice, our collective power can bring about change that no movement can achieve alone. I saw this firsthand when I co-led protests against Nelly's Sports Bar in Washington, D.C. in 2021 after a security guard dragged a black woman down the stair by her hair. We protested this bar for 2 months, got it shut down for a month and a half. And we really started to see collective action that existed across spaces. Out there, we saw so many movement spaces that were pushing back on this bar. And I'll admit, it was hard because if people don't love anything else in DC, they love a liquor. They love a happy hour. And so, because of that, people were up. Some people were genuinely upset. That was an isolated incident, some would say. That wasn't really what the bar was about. And I would say, okay, check their BBB, and you would see something different. It would tell a different story. But what that taught me in that moment is that no matter how struggling this is, no matter how hard this is, we are doing it for the right reason, and we did it with collective movement building. So reality TV, of course, often reveals more about societal realities than fictional media ever could. It does have its raw and scripted moments, and that's the potential to showcase complexities. It's more than drama, I would always argue. But I quickly realized that being on a show designed primarily for entertainment wasn't just about showing up for the cameras. It was about navigating deeper societal dynamics at play. Reality TV, and if you watch reality TV in here, it can be lighthearted. For many of us, it's a form of escapism. But it does often amplify the same structures that we are fighting against if we really pay attention to it. There were episodes of reality TV that have talked about abortion care. There were episodes that talked about police violence, and this is just on VH1, right? And so if you're just looking for that, for the drama, which again, that's what escapism does, someone's life has to be worse than mine, right? It really does actually underscore something that's really happening in real life. The challenges of presenting yourself authentically on TV can be the challenge here, and they reflect the difficulties that we oftentimes do face when working across movements and movement spaces. Both experiences, however, taught me the importance of remaining steadfast in who you are, how you show up, what you stand for, being more sane than your cast members at times. And then it's things where media cannot fully do, but it's important for us to still hold those dynamics together. So I'll say, because I'm probably a little over time, so thank you for your patience, in that it is always going to be important for us to elevate marginalized voices. Always, always, always. And I'm going to say this in this room because it feels like the room to say it in a good space to say it in. We always have to think truly, and this is true in policy especially and in research, what it means to honor trans people within reproductive health rights and justice spaces. In my experience, I have seen and heard so many ableist and transphobic comments, even when it comes, especially when it comes to things like pregnancy and pregnancy related care and who is even capable of becoming pregnant. Even the language of expanding things to like trans or pregnant people have received a lot of pushback, even when people have testified in Congress about it, right? And we see it in legislative text and bill titles. And it's the thing that I'm always waving my hand in any parliament, and some of you in the room know. I will always say, like, okay, who is this helping or hurting? And what does this actually mean to build activist spaces and negotiate ourselves away before any other person ever could? We always have to start with broader movement based things that support everyone and not cut ourselves in the very beginning, because that ultimately teaches people that you don't care about them from the onset, and it makes them never want to build with you again. So that's something to always keep in mind. And frankly, a lot of LGBTQ plus movements are experiencing it still because of bills and laws in the 90s and early 2000s related to employment non-discrimination, where trans people were one of the ones who were cut at the very end of policies. And so I'm always finding it important to mention that in this space, because we all of us, every single one of us, including myself, have to do better actually honoring the communities that we claim to want to support and elevate. So my call to action is this. I want to leave you with something that's, I hope, is simple but still powerful. And it's just that movements are always going to be stronger together. Collaboration between racial justice, queer liberation, queer justice, or excuse me, gender justice, and other movements, it's possible and it's essential. The fights are interconnected. They can never exist in silos. If they do, we risk missing the bigger picture. As I leave today, and as you leave today, I challenge you to think about how you can bring movement building into your own work. Whether you're working in law, policy, or advocacy, or in any other field, ask yourself, who is often overlooked? Whose voices do I always hear from? Whose voices do I never hear from? What does the data say? What does the data not say? And how we can actually plan to make research and policy better together. According to Audre Lorde, and I always mention Audre Lorde because I just love her so much, and it's why my dog's name is Audre Lorde Mitchum. Uh, and she black, so that makes it even better. So Audre Lorde always said, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. Showing up fully and authentically in our work and in our lives is an act of power. It is through this authenticity that we not only transform ourselves, but create spaces for others to step into their own power as well. I thank you so much for listening to me today, and create movements together. Thank you.